bring me some gold and
Yes.
we'll do it.
Yes. So the rabbis defend him. You know how? So there's a midrash that says that he initially went to them with Hur, who is I think Miriam's son, so his nephew, and they were like, "You stop messing around," and they go, "Who you tell us what to do?" And they kill Hur. And he goes, "Oh, just well, what do you need?"
But that's not in there, is it?
No, of course, because they have to justify it. Why doesn't he stand up to them?
Yeah.
Because that should be what his first role should be.
Yeah.
But that's how they try to explain it. Because otherwise, it seems right that he's just enabled. I don't know actually. Check, check. Check 1, 2. Good afternoon, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Glad to have you here for our second talk as part of the Margulis Scholar in Residence Weekend. Thank you again, always to Bert and Elaine Margulis for sponsoring our Scholars in Residence for the past few years. We are delighted to have Nadine Epstein with us once again. If you weren't here last night, this is her short biography. So Nadine Epstein is an award-winning journalist, essayist, author, social entrepreneur, and speaker. She's the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment magazine and co-founder of the Moment Institute for Middle East Fellows. Her books include RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which was written in collaboration with Justice Ginsburg, and we're going to get a presentation of that tonight at 7. She's also written Elie Wiesel, An Extraordinary Life and Legacy, Writings, Photographs, and Reflections, Spiritual Bathing, Healing Rituals and Traditions from Around the World, Rainforest Home Remedies, The Maya Way to Heal Your Body and Replenish Your Soul, and Sastun, My Apprentice with a Mayan Healer. She's also contributed to anthologies The Late Great Mexican Border and Racing in the Street, the Bruce Springsteen Reader. Her works have been published in Moment, The Washington Post, The New York Times Magazine, Smithsonian, and Newsweek. She's also a mixed media artist and creator of the Eyeshadow Project. If you want to learn more about any of those, her website is really easy to remember. It's nadineepstein.com. That's the short one. If you want more, you have to go to the website. So today we're going to be talking about the life and legacy of Elie Wiesel and also about anti-Semitism and the current state of the world. So many of you obviously know something about Elie Wiesel, but maybe not everything. So a great place obviously to learn more is from her work. But he initially didn't start out as a Holocaust kind of advocate, a human rights advocate. Initially he was a journalist. And he is one of the co-founders of Moment magazine, where Nadine is currently the CEO and editor-in-chief. So she got to know him in a different setting than maybe most people think of him in terms of the public role that he played. So my first question is, what can you tell us about Elie Wiesel, the man, not just the figure?
Well, it's a great question. So I took over Moment in I started working at Moment in 2003 and saw that it might close. And I ended up taking it over and raising the money and borrowing money and putting it in a nonprofit. And I didn't really know anything about its history except that I thought it had this incredible legacy, Elie Wiesel and Leonard Fine. And there had been great writers in it, Chaim Potok, and especially the singer, and Yossi Klein Halevi. All these people Yossi Klein Halevi got his start at Moment. So the first thing I did was, called Leonard Fine and called Elie Wiesel and said, hello. I was very scared. And I went to see Elie. I lived in D.C., and I went to see Elie in Boston. And he had a beautiful office. He taught at Boston University. And when I got in there, my heart was pounding because, I had read Night. And in my mind, I was talking to this 14-year-old boy who had gone through this, horrific experience. And it took me a while to realize I was actually talking to a really wise, wonderful man who was so lovely to me personally. He was so kind, and he was every time I saw him, he would say, what can I do for you? And there aren't very many people who really say that and mean that. And he was just for me, he was just a lovely person. It took me a while to get over seeing him as Elie Wiesel and just to see him as a human being. And I only really got to have that place maybe in the year before he died, where I could just begin to talk to him and he could just talk to me. And, we could have some fun together. And I discovered he was very mischievous. He had a twinkle in his eye, and he didn't exactly tell jokes. That wasn't his thing. But he had this way about him it really put you at ease. Once I got over, I'm talking to Elie Wiesel kind of thing. So, anyways, so for me, he was just somebody that I found I could trust. So.
Can you talk a little bit about his work founding Moment magazine and what he hoped to accomplish by creating it?
So he grew up in Siget, and he was really a yeshiva boy. and he, read the Talmud. He was actually reading the Talmud and reading the Kabbalah before he was supposed to be doing that. And so yeshiva boys didn't read newspapers. But his father was not a yeshiva boy. His father got Der Moment. Der Moment was a Yiddish daily that was published in Warsaw from 1910 to 1939 when the Nazis invaded, and closed the paper, and the editors were eventually killed. And every day, Elie Wiesel's father would read Der Moment on the kitchen table and leave it on the kitchen table, and Elie would kind of just peer over it to see what was on the paper, but he never actually picked it up. Later on, when he went through the Holocaust and came out on the other side and decided that he wasn't really going to be, he wasn't going to be a rabbi, wasn't going to follow a religious path. What he really wanted to do was be a writer, and he wanted to be a journalist, and he had this whole career as a journalist, which was very impressive, actually. And that's how he ends up in New York, because he's actually writing for Yehidot Aharonot. He's covering the UN for them in New York. He had this dream. He always wanted to found a magazine. And in 1974, Leonard Fine, who was then a professor at Brandeis University of Political Science, came to him and said, let's do this together. And then they came up with the name. Both of them are gone. Each one of them told me they came up with the name. But Der Moment, because they wanted to name the magazine and keep the legacy of this independent newspaper, which was so beloved, alive. So, and they did that, and they founded it. And then Elie stayed for, Elie was the literary editor, and Leonard Fine was the editor. And as Elie always told me, I like to start things and then move on. He didn't say those words quite, but that's basically what it is. So he stayed for a year, and then he went and he moved on. Now this was in 1975. He hadn't won the Nobel Peace Prize yet. He still wasn't really, the Elie Wiesel, he didn't have the fame Elie Wiesel that he was about to get. Even though, of course, his book, Night, had come out. He'd written several versions in the 1950s. It had come out in the United States in the 1961 or 62. It only had, when it originally only sold maybe 3,000 copies. Got great literary reviews and great criticism, but he wasn't a big name. So when he founded Moment, he still was not a really famous person yet, but it was something that really he cared about. Leonard Fine ran it until 1986, and they founded this magazine to be a magazine for America's Jews and to be leading the conversation for American Jews. And they both had very different kinds of conversations that they would lead. I mean, Elie had a very different way of looking at the world than Leonard Fine. Leonard Fine actually sold the magazine to Herschel Shanks, who's also passed on. He was very famous for being the lawyer who litigated the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he had another magazine called Biblical Archaeology. And so he took Moment and moved it into his little cluster of magazines, archaeology magazines. And that's when I worked there just for a few months. Well, for 11 months, just kind of a fluke that I ended up there, because I had been a journalist and a writer. And that's when I decided, well, I want to save this magazine. So I knocked on Herschel's door, and I hadn't ever run a magazine. I'd been a journalist, and said, well, how about if I take over the magazine? And he laughed at me. And he said, well, who are you? And then he said, and do you have any money? So the answer was, I was just me, and two, no. But I decided now I look back at this 20 years ago and went, wow, was I gutsy? I did this. I put together the money. He wouldn't give me the computers. All I got was the list of people in the magazine, like the subscribers. And in those days, even 20 years ago, it's just a list of print subscribers. There was no website. There was a little tiny website, actually, I should say that. There was nothing else. And so somehow, 20 years later, Moment is reaching now, 1.5 million people through print, through newsletters, through web, through public affairs programming, through all these amazing programs that we have and projects that we have. And so it's really amazing that what's happened to the magazine.
So a lot of us think of Elie Wiesel after he became famous, and he became this huge human rights activist and spokesperson and advisor about kind of all things Holocaust related. As you alluded to, he didn't start out that way. He started out as a journalist. He wrote his book Night in the 50s. It didn't really take off till much, much later. Can you tell us a little bit about how he kind of became this real public figure, advocate for human rights, Holocaust educator?
Well, so after he died, I went to his funeral in July of 2016, July 2nd, 2016, and then I left the synagogue, which is a Fifth Avenue synagogue in New York, and I was thinking about what can I do, because there's so many people I know, by the way, who don't even recognize his name. You know, often I'm talking about the magazine and I say it was founded by Elie Wiesel and Leonard Fine, and people just look at me blankly. Some people know Leonard Fine, some people know Elie Wiesel, some people have never heard of any of them. However, if I take a Lyft or Uber or I'm just out in the world, almost nobody knows who Elie Wiesel is. It's really incredible. And so I had this idea that I really wanted to do something to help people to remember him. And so we put together this beautiful book called Elie Wiesel, Extraordinary Life and Legacy. One of the things that's so interesting in the book is that it has a lot of beautiful photos. I didn't even mean to have photos in it in the beginning, but once I started looking at the photos of Elie, he was so photogenic, incredibly and you could see these photos from when he was young, and then he's a young man, he's living in France after the Holocaust, and then he comes to New York. He never smiles. This is a man who is really quite troubled, a young man who's quite troubled. And you can see the evolution of him coming out of himself and realizing it's not just about him and his story, and that he can help other people, and that he can bring these stories out. And you can see that just by looking at the photos in the book, which I always find amazing. So he basically, because of Night, and because he also was a beautiful speaker, and a wonderful writer, and a charismatic man in his very quiet way, he definitely became one of the leaders among the Holocaust survivors. And then he became well known, in particular during the Reagan administration, when he stood up and was one of a variety of Holocaust survivors, really, who sent the telegram and said, "Please don't go to Bitburg." I think that, and he just so happened that he was supposed to be getting the Medal of Honor from Reagan in the next week in the East Room. So that propelled him, his standing up to Reagan about Bitburg really propelled him to people's consciousness. And then later on, when Carter was president, actually Carter was president before that, so, right? Stu Eisenstadt was looking for somebody who could help be the public figure for the Holocaust Museum. And he thought of Elie Wiesel as being that. So Elie Wiesel became the head of that commission. So I think these two things really brought him into public attention. First was the Holocaust Memorial, the Holocaust Commission, and then second was Bitburg. And that was around the time, that's sort of what got his attention and why he was even considered for a Nobel Peace Prize. Once you get the Nobel Peace Prize, of course, then you have an imprimatur that, is amazing. And he created his foundation, the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity. And he used that in all sorts of different ways. And one of them was to bring together different Nobel Peace Prize laureates to think about what to do about the world. So he was somebody who was so curious. I think that's another thing about him. He was always learning. He wasn't just, I learned some things when I was a kid, and I learned some things here, and I learned some things there. He was always learning, always reading, always talking to people, and always talking to people who he disagreed with. He had a lot of personal conversations going on with just people you would be surprised that he was talking to. And I think, again, that's a wonderful, wonderful trait. So he really did become he grew into a voice that people on the left, people on the right, governments of different kind, different leaders could trust. As he got older, he fell into he was not, he lost some of his. He made that decision to go and speak when Netanyahu spoke during the Obama administration in Congress, and he lost a lot of admirers certainly in the center and on the left. But I think there are many reasons why that happened. But he wasn't, as he got older, he was getting older. I don't think he had the range of skills that he had when he was a younger man. So.
Thank you. So he was obviously a huge advocate for human rights, for Holocaust education, also extremely pro-Israel, especially thought of himself as an advocate and a defender of Israel. Considering that America's been amazing to the Jews, but there's always been an undercurrent of anti-Semitism, and he was so concerned about educating, not just about the Holocaust, but about anti-Semitism. What do you think he would say about the kind of the new wave of anti-Semitism that we saw, not just since October 7th, but let's say the wave that we saw starting with the Charlottesville march, the Unite the Right march, and then moving into what's been happening just the past 5 months?
Well, I want to answer that question, but I also want to say that, he did have a very complicated relationship with Israel. It wasn't, he went to Palestine when he was maybe 18 or 19, and he had an assignment there to be writing about, he was living in France, to be writing about how the Olim, all the immigrants, were being treated. And he went around, he spent 5 months in Israel, and he went around, and he was very taken aback by how Israel was treating Olim, especially Holocaust survivors. And so he never published those stories. And he made a decision at a certain point that he didn't want to live in Israel, he wanted to live in New York. He was very supportive of Israel, but he also was not always supportive, although he didn't speak about it, of every Israeli government. He felt that it was not his role to criticize an Israeli government, but it didn't mean that he didn't think about, he disagreed with Israeli governments. So, I just want to point out that, he wasn't like a blind, he loved Israel. He and his wife, the foundation, funded some amazing programs for Ethiopian Jews in Israel that are still going on today. He had a lot of ties to Israel. He's not as respected or known in Israel as he is here. So just to clarify a little bit about that. He was somebody who felt so strongly that the story of the Holocaust can't be forgotten. And I think that that lesson is more important today than ever. The Holocaust is the story of the Jews, but it's a bigger story than the Jews. It's a story about human nature story. It's the history. It's an example of human nature, and I think of it as the most clear example of evil in our time, in our memory, in our current memory. And I think it's very important for us, and Elie felt this so strongly, to be telling the stories of Holocaust survivors and teaching about the Holocaust. He helped that whole, at the beginning, when Holocaust survivors came here, we've done a lot of stories on this, most of them didn't talk about what had happened to them. It was just too much, and they just wanted to move on, they wanted to assimilate, they wanted their kids to have a new life. And it was a process where he actually was teaching for a while at City College. It was his first job as a professor. And some of his students were Holocaust survivors, children of Holocaust survivors. And he encouraged them to talk to their parents and hear their stories and write down those stories. And he helped open the floodgates of those stories coming out. Now, there's so many stories. I was just talking to an author who has a story about Holocaust, a book about her father, and who was a Holocaust survivor. And I was just talking to an agent 2 days ago, she was saying, there's just so many stories. I know the market is so flooded. I don't even know how to get them published anymore. But somehow they get published, by the way. And sometimes they're self-published. But those stories now are out there, and they're so important for us to share with people. And they're so important for us to share with people who aren't Jewish, not just for us. And night is read in a lot of schools, a lot of middle schools, high schools, but not all of them. And but I think that's a very important legacy that he left, is that book is read, and Anne Frank is read, and Viktor Frankl is read. I mean, like on his name, periodic table. Who's the other really famous author? Anyways,
Primo Levi.
What?
Primo Levi.
Primo Levi. It's so important.
He was a chemist. He didn't invent the periodic table. But I understood what you were saying.
Yes, thank you. He wrote a book. There's so many. I mean, Elie was one of the first writers, and those were some of their early writers, Viktor Frankl, Primo Levi. But now there's so many. So all I can say is that this was something that meant so much to him. On the other hand, he was a particularist. He cared about Jews, but he also cared about the world, and he was a universalist. And he took the message of the Holocaust, and he cared about genocide of all kinds, and that was deeply important to him. You know, he went to Bosnia, he went to Cambodia, and Elisha, his son, is now actually taking the foundation. He's running the foundation, and he's focusing on the Uyghur, because he feels like the Uyghur, you know, how many of you even know who the Uyghur are? Okay. Well, so the Uyghur are Muslims who live in a certain, you know, province of China, who have, you know, really been facing systematic eradication of their views and often death in a very serious way. So, like, Elisha feels like that's really an important message to continue. So you want me to connect this with anti-Semitism today? Well, I always think about this because for a while I was thinking, well, I have mixed feelings. I'm like, well, I'm so happy Elie didn't get to see this. On the other hand, for a few years I was wishing Elie was here, because Elie had the stature for people to listen to him. And especially during the Trump administration, I felt like he would be able to speak to all sides. He had that respect. And it's hard to say what leaders have emerged to replace him. Not anyone could replace one particular person, but we're still waiting for leaders to emerge. So I feel like he really could have helped the situation. But on the other hand, you know, it's bigger than any one person. So I don't know if I answered your question there.
Somewhat, but I'm going to keep going.
Answer it. Ask me ask me it again.
Well, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. So some states have mandatory Holocaust education, others don't. So those states, in general, I've seen, you know, the reports that those high school students know more about World War II and the Holocaust than states that don't have it. But I know there's also been some pushback from some Jews. I think Dara Horn wrote an article that said it can't just be Holocaust education, because then people have a very skewed view of Jews. I know in Germany they have a program called Meet a Jew, because they have great Holocaust education mandatory in Germany, but people think of Jews as in one particular way because of that, because there's so few Jews left in Germany.
Actually, there's now so many Jews living in Germany. Berlin is the fastest growing Jewish community.
It's true. It's amazing, right? Israelis move to Berlin because they feel more comfortable sometimes in Germany, which is, we could talk about that too if you want. But so I'm curious what you think about the state of Holocaust education versus, in general, the state of how much can we ask people to know about Jews in general, in particular how that actually relates to what's going on now when people talk about the conflict in Israel and between Israelis and Palestinians, and this concept of who owns the land, who's native, who's indigenous, and
there's a lot of questions.
Yes, I know. I got 7 questions for you.
Let's start with the first one,
Okay.
and then you go back in there.
Okay.
So MoMA did a really great story on looking at Holocaust education over the years in the United States and also another country, in Germany, but mostly focusing on the United States. And when Holocaust education was really invented in the late 60s and in the 70s, it was not just about Jews. It was using the Holocaust to teach about tolerance and to learn about what can happen and what we can do to stand up to prevent that from happening again. And that's so important. Somewhere along the way, there are many schools who, and there are various programs, some of them are just focused on Jews, but most of them really aren't. And so it's so interesting. So I know Dara, I think that, like I did a program, it was so interesting. I did a program for WNET TV. I work with their staff sometimes. And one of the employees there said to me, my son is in school, and because all the kids are learning about Holocaust education, they're using that information against the Jews. And so we interviewed him and we talked to him. And yes, when kids learn about something, sometimes kids draw a swastika. It's hard to say what all that means, but it's much more important for us to be teaching about the Holocaust, but always in context of the lessons that it has for humanity. We can't only think about Jews all the time. We can't teach that. We want to connect with people. We have to connect the Holocaust to everyone. And of course, a lot of other people were killed in the Holocaust besides Jews, and that's always important to bring up as well. It is not, there were Roma, there were Catholics, there were communists, there were other people besides Jews. And so we don't want to make it like only it's a Jewish thing. I just feel very important. And I feel now you can ask the rest of your question.
So what do you feel in terms of how Holocaust education is done? Where is it done well? Maybe where is it not? And do you agree with Dara, I think, where she said it can't be the only thing people know about Jews? And then the follow-up to that is, do we want to, we can't mandate, Israel education, but is part of what's going on now
save on
a
the
lack
Israel,
of Israel
yeah.
education? Okay.
We definitely don't want the Holocaust to be the only thing Jews know about Jews and the only thing other people know about Jews. And I do think that for many, many people, the Holocaust is what makes them identify as Jews. There's always that line that, we weren't really that Jewish. We thought we were assimilated, but the Nazis came for us anyways. So that thought is in the minds of so many Jews. So I feel like in the terms of this conversation, it's really important for Jews to connect with people in all sorts of ways. I have every year for many years, I run this campaign around Seder, Passover, which is always invite people who are not Jewish to your Seders. I have always done that. In fact, I've had Seders where my son and I were the only Jews. And they were amazing Seders, and we all had incredible conversations. And we had adopted an African-American man as part of our family who was homeless, and he came to live with us, and that we took care of him for years, and he was my son's his other grandfather. And he would always sit at the head of the table, and he would talk about what it was like to be the son of a sharecropper whose father had been a slave, and how difficult we live in Washington, D.C., and what it was like to be a black man in an era where Washington, D.C. was a segregated city, and how scared he had been growing up. And all this was just so powerful to a learning experience for my son, and a learning experience for all the guests who were there, who learned about Judaism, but also learned about all these other important values that were there, that were within Judaism. It just connected everything. So I always feel like it's so important for us one-on-one to connect with people who are not part of our community. It doesn't mean you have to pick the angriest person on the street corner screaming to invite to your Seder. That's not the way to do it. But somebody that you know from work, or someone you know from school, or friends of your kids, and invite them and include them. That's how we fight anti-Semitism in the long run, is by, and Shabbat dinners is the same way. Bring them into the family. That's so important. So.
And what do you think about the unleashing, the uncovering of anti-Semitism, the way it's experienced now post-October 7th in terms of people seemingly advocating for, not just for Palestinians, but for even Hamas or for this resistance against Israel, and how does that relate to the way people understand Jews and their role in society?
So anti-Semitism is so complex, and Dara would argue that anti-Semitism has been like right in our faces for all the time. It's just always been there in the United States, but like right up front. And I disagree with Dara. I like her. We're friends. She wouldn't mind that I'm using her name here. I actually think that anti-Semitism for many decades was really inhabiting the fringes, which is where it's been inhabiting. It's been living in the fringes forever. That's not true. In the past, there was anti-Semitism, but a much more, certainly, even in the United States, much more in-your-face way. But certainly in my lifetime, I didn't really experience much anti-Semitism. I experienced a couple incidents of one or two, but mostly what I bumped into was gender issues. That was hugely important. So I would say that I look at it this way. On July 2nd, 2016, when Donald Trump tweeted his an image of Hillary Clinton with like a George Soros-like figure and a Jewish star, that opened a portal for anti-Semitism that's always been within the white supremacist movement to come out into the mainstream. And we saw that, and that was very obvious. It was very obvious in Washington, D.C. How many of you have heard of Pizzagate? I live about 2 blocks from Pizzagate, from Comet Pizza. So suddenly the street was blocked off, and one of my writers was actually on a date inside Pizzagate. Nobody was hurt, but this happens right outside. This is in my neighborhood. Then a couple days later, my husband goes outside, and what's outside on the sidewalk are anti-Semitic leaflets. We've never seen anti-Semitic leaflets in our life, really, in my lifetime. There's swastikas suddenly on like mailboxes. And then, has anyone heard of Richard Spencer? Richard Spencer was part of this, has his own right-wing group, and he had a victory party at Maggiano's, which was like 3 blocks the other direction from my house. This is all in a matter of a couple months. So there was a tangible difference all throughout the United States, and then this led to the Unite the Right rally. Then, and there's a lot to say about that, but then I look at not just October 7th, I actually think of it as October 14th. Because on October 7th, I think Israel had a lot of sympathy. People were in shock. But on October 14th, there was the explosion in the parking lot of the Al-Arab hospital in Gaza, which automatically was assumed by the New York Times and many other publications to be because of an Israeli missile. And it turns out it wasn't. But at that moment, we saw public opinion just move against Israel. And it really hasn't changed since then. And what it brought out was anti-Semitism that has long existed on the far left in the United States and brought that into the mainstream. So I look, now we have these two kinds of anti-Semitisms, and of course there's many more, but these are very, very powerful streams that are all mixed together in the mainstream. And both of them need to be countered, and both of them need to be thought of. We can't, it's just not on the left, it's just not on the right, it's both. And they have, but I look at anti-Semitism as a symptom of the instability we're experiencing in our country right now. There are lots of reasons. I look at it and I think of it in geopolitical terms. Like, why are we having this right now? Yes, we have issues in our country, but there's also some incredible things going on beyond our country. Why did October 7th happen? How did Hamas get all that, arms and training? From Iran. Who is Iran supporting, in their war against Ukraine? Putin. I mean, there are a lot of things going on, and I wrote about this in a recent issue. I feel like the Western world order that has grown out of the Enlightenment, including the Jewish Haskalah, and has been evolving for many years, and in which democracy is a huge part of it, is really under threat. And that threat comes from within, but a lot of that threat has been injected from instability from Iran and from Russia, some from China. And may I point out, these are all incredibly, like if you look at a picture of any of the leaders, I mean, there isn't a woman in the picture. There's not even a token woman in the picture. I mean, it's so incredible. They are really, what they are doing is undermining and working to undermine what we have created for generations. And so I know that we have to pay attention to the anti-Semitism that's going on in our country, but we also need to be thinking about, what do we do about the big picture? How can we help? It has to be thought about as well.
I want to put a pin in the state of the world, and I want to come back to it, but I want to do one more question about anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, because there's different opinions about how to address it. Some people are more head-on, kind of like the ADL. Anytime you see something anti-Semitic, it's kind of like whack-a-mole, you hit it, and you go around, and anytime you see something, you call it out. Others have a different take, and they say, no, you just live Jewishly. Their haters are going to hate, but so go out and just live your best Jewish life. Others say, well, you're never going to convince the fringes. You need to make more allies amongst the kind of the mainstream and build up relationships with people who are not opposed to you, but maybe just don't know you. Do you have an opinion as to
Yes.
all of them, or do you have one you think is a more efficient strategy?
Well, I think you can tell from everything I said already, I'm in the third category. And I run a project called the Wide River Project, where Eric K. Ward, who's a civil rights strategist, where we host conversations into the complexity of the Black-Jewish relationship. And we call it the Wide River Project because there's so many streams, so many channels in that. And if we only focus on, the one or two that are negative, we don't really get to understand all of it. And so that's a really important thing. There's a reason why this issue is called Voices Against Bigotry, because I was at a play in December called Abraham Joshua's Passover Eve. It was a one-night play at JTS. And it was a beautiful play it was a one-man play about Abraham Joshua Heschel planning the Seder, and that Martin Luther King was going to come the next day to his house.
Which is true.
This is true.
Yes.
And afterwards, there was a talk back, and a woman got up, and she raised her hand, and she said, Abraham Joshua Heschel would just roll over in his grave if he knew how all of our allies hated us now, were all against us. And I went, oh my God. So I got up, and I said, well, actually, I talk to people all the time, and not everybody's against us. And we have to amplify those voices who aren't against us, and we have to talk to people and get to know them. And those people are as scared as everybody else. So I went out of my way, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people I could have included, but this was Muslim and Arab Voices Against Bigotry. And, there is a wonderful woman I spoke to, Zainab Khan. She is that co-founder and chair of the Muslim American Leadership Alliance. And she nurtures, anyway, she and all these other women are having conversations about what we can do together. They're all anti-Hamas. They all are but it's not like they care greatly about what's happening in Gaza, as I'm sure most of you do too. But they really want to have communication and stay in communication with their Jewish friends. Mohammed Dajani, who's a dear friend of mine, who has an organization about creating moderation in Islam. Mansour Abbas, who I really want to interview, who is the leader of the Arab List Party in Israel, who is in a very difficult position now, but has come out very clearly against Hamas. There are so many people that are not, who are saying, and I think really care and believe about the right things. So I'm making a real effort. I've been speaking, I've done some programs on WNET, we do some on JBS, a lot in the magazine, a lot of interviews through our Moment Live program, which by the way are all free, momentlive.com/Zoominars, you can go to our site. We actually even hosted a class with a brilliant woman in the last 4-part class, which about Black history. It's really Black history for Jews. It's really important for us to understand Black history. And now we're going to create a Jewish history class for Blacks because they know as little, some of them, most of them know as little about us as we know about them. So I feel very strongly that that's the only place that we can be at this point. We have to be communicating. We can't just go, just gonna. So let me say one more thing. So my nephew, who lives in Santa Monica, and he goes to Santa Monica High School. I think I just was talking about this at lunch. He is the president of the Jewish Students Association, and I've been kind of texting him and going, well, what's happening? And basically he's been going, nothing. It's been happening. And then on Thursday, for the first time, a poster went up in school, and it was at Free Palestine. And an Instagram account was created, and it has 12 followers. And I took him out to dinner on Thursday night, and we had a big conversation about this. Should he go all out? He has to make a decision. He's the president of the club. Should he go all out and make 100 posters? Should they have a demonstration? Should they do this? He went through all these things. What he decided in the end was that he's going to make one poster, and it's going to say, anti-Semitism is not good for anyone. Come to our Jewish Student Union meeting. Just very simple, as opposed to just going tit for tat or going overwhelmed. Well, we'll see what happens. But there are so many, it's very small problem in Santa Monica High School. It's not like many other places. But, he has to figure out how to handle it, and we all do. And on some places, it's very, very difficult. We hear about all the schools that have done a terrible job. We don't often hear about Dartmouth, which had, right in the beginning, created a real dialogue program that's been exceptionally successful. And it's not the only school where they've done a really good job of handling it. And then we see some schools that have done terrible jobs of handling it. So anyways, I don't know if I answered your question again.
So I'm going to go back to we were talking before about kind of the New World Order and how things can be confusing. Over lunch we were talking, I mentioned that I just heard an interesting quote from Rabbi David Wolpe, who said part of the way that people have kind of realigned, there's always been polarizations, but there's a kind of a new realignment and polarization. He said people were surveyed 50 years ago and said, would you marry someone outside of your race? And most people, the vast majority, would say no. But would you marry someone who would vote differently than you? And they would say, of course. You ask that today, the vast majority of people would say, I have no issue marrying someone outside my race, but I have a huge issue marrying outside someone who would vote differently than I. Part of the problem is we paint people with these broad brush strokes of certain things. How do you see, or do you see is this trends that kind of go cyclically? There's always going to be polarization. It's just different, and this is the polarization we have now. Or do you see something in particular that is leading to this kind of polarization in the world? And of course, the question that's always, and what does this mean for the Jews?
Okay. So I think that definitely within my lifetime, we have more polarization than I experienced, in the last few decades, previous decades. But there have been many other eras of polarization. I think who was I talking to last night? I was talking about 1916. I was just I'm reading Prequel by Rachel Maddow, who's talking about what Huey Long was doing and stirring up all this stuff in the 1930s. We tend to forget polarization, when we're looking back historically. But there's there's some new elements here, and again, that have added to polarization. And some of those have to do with technology. I mean, social media. I just did a program with Chuck Todd on social media and anti-Semitism. I mean, social media and polarization, forget anti-Semitism. It's a huge, it's a way for people we don't know to, and sometimes countries we don't know, because we really don't know who's behind a lot of posts. We don't know whether it's the Russian government. We don't know whether it's the Chinese government. We don't know whether it's some little Montenegro Liberation Front. We have no idea what is behind a lot of what we're reading. So we need to, we're no longer just reading, a few sources. We have kind of endless sources too. So that's a big problem. I do think the media, that the fact that we have so many different kind of media now, that it's just almost anyone, not almost, anyone can start. If you get a little money, you can start your own news project. You could start your own Instagram news. You could start your own Substack. Everyone is so interested in being an influencer and giving their ideas out and wanting to influence and wanting to go viral, become famous with whatever they think. And of course, whatever the more outlandish your ideas, the more hits you get. So social media has had a terrible impact, I think. I don't think that we as humans, we have to learn how to handle social media. It's not in our human nature. Like, we respond too quickly, and it's going to only get worse because we have AI coming. AI is already here, but it's coming in a new way. So we'll have to be able to use our own personal wisdom to know what is written by AI. And it's going to be impossible. So it's really important that when you're reading something, or when you're, whether it's online, whether it's in social media, that you really know what the sources are before you share it or pass it on with anyone. I mean, there's some wisdom in the whole Lashon Hara for Judaism. It's basically a lot of what appears to be news is gossip, and we got to be really careful about that. And we really have to use our critical thinking skills. So that's very, very important. In terms of polarization, I guess what I'm trying to do is create as many bonds as I can with people who I disagree with. I want to maintain my friendships or relationships of some kinds with those people. And I talk a little about this in the RBG book, because she talks about, she has a famous quote, which is, lead people in a way that they can follow you. And she says, I don't remember the exact words of the quote, but you have to be able to talk to people. Like, I think I mentioned this last night. When was the last time you had an argument about politics where you convinced the other person they were wrong and it really stuck? Anybody? No, it just doesn't happen anymore. I actually think the whole idea of debate, of two sides arguing, which is it's a famous rhetorical device that's been part of, humanity, democracy for a long time. I think it's really unhelpful, because this is one reason why I produce symposium. So we have a question. I want to ask 20 people what their points of view are, because there's so many different ways of looking at any question. And what we can do better is to learn from each one of them, and have a bigger picture of the issue or the problem, as opposed to narrowing it down to these debates. So I feel really strongly about that.
So you're in media, started old school, right? Print, actual magazines. I was at a seminar, and they were asking us, rabbis who were between the ages of, let's say, 40 and 80, how much social media content we consume and where we consume it. I can guess by the crowd today, but let's just do this for a second. How many of you, if you're curious about something, get something from Google? Like, you go and look up online, okay? Or maybe you get some news from Facebook? How many of you use Instagram to get information about the world? and TikTok. Okay. So the way this person presented to us was saying anyone younger than you, he was talking to rabbis, I think the youngest person in the room was 40, said probably anyone under 20, it's the inverse, right? Well, the way we would use Google to find some information, they use the search function on TikTok. And assume whatever, first few things they see, that's the gospel, not to use that in synagogue, but that's what's going on. So how do you, as media's changed so much in the past 10, 15 years, how does traditional media, even long-form media, address the shortened attention spans and the new ways that people consume information?
Great question. First of all, I think there's always been people who read and people who don't read. And that still exists. There are still young people who read and all sorts of read books and read magazines. They may not read newspapers, but they're definitely still reading, they're still reading. We talk about this all the time in our different editorial meetings. We do a lot of social media. Basically, I've kept the print issue because we have a lot of print readers still. And because also I think the quality of it informs everything we do. For many years, I've been a judge of the National Magazine Awards. And in the beginning, they had separate sections. They had like digital publications, and then they had print publications. And the quality was incredibly different. And then they decided just to put them together. But still, one thing that I noticed, and I haven't done it this year, I didn't do it last year, and I won't be there this year either, is that the quality of the print stories are always better than the quality of the digital stories. The amount of editing and thought that somehow goes into print and putting it into a print design is different. So there is a real element of quality, and I think how our brains absorb information and keep information is different. Like, when we're reading an article and we're reading online. That said, I read a lot of stuff online as well. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to get our content out to people of different ages. So we actually, what we're trying to do is take our content and put it into Reels and TikTok and Instagram and into little blocks in Instagram and do what everybody else is doing, trying to have it go viral on one of those mediums so that we're reaching a different element, a different age group. And it's not an easy task because a lot of the things that go viral are not serious. They're fun. They're not about topics that we've done. And the thing we've done most that I interviewed, does anybody know Bruce Springsteen? So I grew up in Asbury Park, New Jersey, but I interviewed I honored Max Weinberg, and I interviewed Max Weinberg, his drummer. And so we put that out on TikTok, and it went, and even though he's not a young guy, it still did fabulously well on TikTok, and he spoke about some really interesting things, but really, I'm not sure anybody got that. They really wanted just to see him and hear him sing. So it's very, very hard for us and for everyone to get kind of a serious content. So there was a really interesting article in the New York Times, though, and we're about to start this. We're going to start basically our own, not just an Instagram account, but an Instagram kind of channel, which will have its own content, so we're about to experiment with something new, because Instagram is really where a lot of people are now getting their news, even more than TikTok. A lot of young people are getting their news from Instagram.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the congregation. So I want to shift gears. I want to go back to talking about Israel. So in the late 90s, there was a push to do birthright, to connect Jews, young Jews already almost 25 years ago. They were saying young Jews aren't connecting to Israel or even to their Jewish identity. We'll send them on these free trips to Israel. It's had some success, but as you look at kind of polls, you see people feeling less and less connected to Israel. There seemed to be a growing gap between Israeli Jews and American Jews, especially as American Jews were becoming more liberal politically and secular in terms of the religious divide, and Israelis were becoming more conservative politically and more religious. Then this past summer, there was Israel was in the news for the first time, not about a war, not about terrorism, but about the whole judicial reform, and there was some kind of confusion about what's going on here, so there was some regained interest, and then the latest war breaks out, and it's being fought there, and to a certain extent it's being fought here in different ways on campuses and social media, in different public places. City Hall, debates about divestment or just statements pro or against. So the question is, but if you can, because everybody wants to know the future, so put on your prophet's hat and tell us, what do you see in terms of, or what do you think will happen in terms of the American Jewish community, the effects of this war on the American Jewish community in terms of how they think about themselves Jewishly? Part two is, how do you think the effect of the war is going to affect the Israeli Jewish community, how they think about themselves Jewishly and Zionistically? And is that going to be, is there any convergence there, or is there going to be continued kind of divergence between the major diasporic Jewish community here in the United States and the major Jewish population obviously in Israel?
Well, it's such a, there are so many Jewish communities in the United States. So I find it hard to talk about one American Jewish community. There are some organizations, there are a whole bunch of organizations that represent themselves as being, the major Jewish communities, major organizations, but there are so many communities here, and there always have been. I'm from a family where there's people who are, have cousins who are married into the, some big Chabad family, and then I have a brother who's married to a Syrian Jewish Orthodox woman and Syrian nephews, and then I have a super atheist brother who has, super culturally Jewish, but absolutely wants nothing to do with religion, and then I have a sister who's Jewish, super militant lesbian. They're all I'm just saying there's so many just in my family. I have a hard time, and they all have very different attitudes about Israel, and they have very different thinkings about their Jewish identity. Some of them question it, some of them don't do any questioning. So I always find it hard to talk about one Jewish community. And the same for Israel. Israel is a very complex society, and it's also very polarized in many ways. And one thing, it was a very interesting story. A few years ago, we did a piece on how much, there's a huge amount of Israel education in Jewish day schools about Israel. There's almost zero about Jews in America in Israeli schools. So they have no understanding of the American Jewish community, and we have some understanding of some parts of the Israeli community. So I just find that to be a hard, I think in terms of, everything is more complex than we always imagine. That said, the war going on right now, that war will be over hopefully soon, and hopefully long before the US presidential election, but it should be, it's got to wind up soon, and hopefully there will be a coming back to another place where some of the anger we've seen will not be as present. But ask your question again, because I'm not quite getting to the answer.
Do you think, or how do you think the war will affect the way Jews here in the United States think about their Jewish identity? How will Israeli Jews be affected?
Let me answer the first part. So I know lots of Jews who have become much more connected to their Jewish identity because of the war, who are wearing their Stars of David, who are just way out there and are out there demonstrating for the return of the hostages. I know so many Jews like that. And then I know so many Jews who are, I'm so upset. I went for a walk with a neighbor who's who's a doctor, and I'm staying for a while near Berkeley. And she's like, I'm Jewish and I'm anti-Israel now. And I was like, well, what does that mean? She goes, well, because I'm pro-Palestinian, I have to be anti-Israel. I said, actually, you don't have to be anti-Israel to be pro-Palestinian. Well, what does that mean? I mean, she's trying to simplify this in her mind. So we spent an hour and a half hiking and walking, talking about that you could actually hold two different feelings and two different, we're big enough that we can be really upset when we see the images and we see what's happening in Gaza. We can hold that, and we can also hold that we can be very, very hurt by what happened on October 7th to Jews, and how Israel was invaded and how Israel was endangered. And we can also have another part of us which says, wow, I'm not sure what the Israeli government is doing. I'm not sure I agree with how they're handling it. I might like Netanyahu. I might not like Netanyahu. But we can have all these different thoughts and be a human being. We don't have to pick one of them. I mean, all of us have a lot of different feelings about this. If we were just one-dimensional, we could say, only thing that we care about right now is one thing. I mean, I don't think that really helps anyone. I think we just have to be willing to hold all this together within ourselves, if that makes sense.
Thank you. All right, we'll take a few questions.
About 10 years ago, I was flipping around on television and came across a debate that was going on, for some reason caught my eye, about the future of journalism. It was at a university, I don't remember which one. I'd say about half of the audience were students, probably who were told they need to be there. And they were there, and about half the audience was adults from the community and the school, etc. And this one guy on the panel, he said, let me ask you a question. How many people read the newspaper before they came here? And all the elderly people, the adults, if you will, raised their hand, and a few didn't. How many of you, and none, I remember him saying that, none of the university students had opened a paper that morning. And he said, how many of you are just going to go online for the headlines and everything? And every one of the students raised their hand. And none of the adults raised their hand. He said, and therein lies the problem with journalism. Somehow you got to figure it out. So you're a journalist. How do you figure out how to put that together?
Well, first of all, journalism it's a really interesting question. Journalism is really an important topic. We saw how journalism failed to cover October 14th, like when that hospital parking lot was blown up. We've seen how journalists have been struggling to cover what's happening in the Middle East. This is why last year I created a program called the Moment Institute Middle East Fellows, which is to train journalists to cover the Middle East, because the Middle East is very complex. And it's not just to study Israel, because you can't just study Israel and learn about Israel without understanding everything else going on in the Middle East. So we put together a fellow residency for 15 fellows, and they came to DC twice, and they came and they met with, all the experts, and Dennis Ross, and Wolf Blitzer, all sorts of people, whatever, all sorts of journalists who came, and David Shipler, who used to be at the New York Times, and Glenn Frankel, who won a Pulitzer, who used to be at the Washington Post. And they all came, and we really spent a long time together learning about the complexity of the issues. And we had journalists who were of Palestinian descent, and we had a journalist from Algeria, and we had journalists who were Jews, and we had journalists who had lived in Israel. And it was an amazing program, because journalists also have to learn to know how to confront the complexity. And your point of that people don't read newspapers, I don't think, so I'm gonna look at my son for a second. So he doesn't really read newspapers in print, but I see that he's very well informed about some things. He's not informed in the way I feel like I'm informed. I believe that one of the things about long-form journalism, or a publication like Moment, is that you really get a lot of different opinions and you get to dive deep into things. And you're absolutely correct that when we're just reading online, we don't get to see, we don't dive as deep, and also we don't see the things that we might not notice. So there's something wonderful about picking up a newspaper, and you never planned on reading the story about, how, I don't know, whatever it is, how Jimmy Carter loved to make ceramics, whatever it is. I've just been thinking about Jimmy Carter recently. That's just not a story you would have noticed, but that you find that story, and that turns out there's something that you really learned in this story. So journalism is definitely going through a very, very difficult time, and there's way too much out of it. And sometimes in the middle of the night I go, well, am I participating in making this worse? And I'm thinking we're not, because I'm thinking what we're providing is something that's really deeply useful. When I stop feeling like that, then I won't do this anymore.
Quick, so we can get to the next.
Another media story I've told you about our grandson at Purdue, but right after the October 7th stuff, when there was all this protesting going on, he said there was an article in the paper, their local paper, just a short article about that a Palestinian had thrown a rock through the Chabad window. That Friday night, that was like on a Wednesday, that Friday night, he always eats at a Chabad because steak and potatoes. So he always goes to Chabad. And the rabbi said he wants everybody to know the paper's been informed, the police have been informed. When he heard the window break, he rushed to see what was going on, and he saw a very guilty-looking 7-year-old boy, standing there. He went around to where the glass was, and there was his little boy's ball. And but the newspaper just immediately had made this a Palestinian-Israeli issue.
It's so amazing how, again, I agree that journalists and humans in general are not handling this situation well. We are not really looking at what really happens. Like sometimes it's not. So Moment has something called the Anti-Semitism Monitor. And Ira Foreman, who used to have Deborah Lipstedt's job, he curates it for us. He's the director of this project. And he will go through papers and he picks incidents of anti-Semitic incidents that he actually thinks are true, that are not just alarmist, oh my God, the sky is falling, the Henny Penny story, remember Henny Penny, kind of stories, and he puts them there, so it's a very trustworthy source. But even so, we always don't know what the motivations of people are. We did another story about mental health and anti-Semitism, because a number of the people who have done some of the worst, most anti-Semitic things that, the shooting at Pittsburgh, are people who are, barely functioning in a mental health way. So there's a lot of this is not outright anti-Semitism, and we have to be very careful to distinguish what is and what isn't. And so many people it's so understandable that people are walking around in an alarmed, it's very alarming, but we have to fight that alarmed feeling, because we can't think clearly when we're alarmed. We have to stay calm. It's so important. So I'm always telling people, it's okay. We have to stay calm, and then you can figure out what's true, what's not true, and what's the next step.
Can I just take the prerogative to add something?
Please.
So something I learned from a podcast a couple of weeks ago, in terms of just how Israel's been covered lately in the war, and someone pointed out, sometimes you'd assume more journalism will lead to better journalism, but it's not. He said it's not always necessarily true. He just kind of pointed to the fact, I think he said AP and Reuters, who are the two major wire services where a lot of media then get their information from. They'll say, we quote a reporter from the AP or from Reuters. He said something like, and don't quote me on this, maybe they have 24 paid staff just in their Jerusalem bureau, and then they maybe have 12 paid staff for the entire continent of Africa. So he says, so why do you think there is so much news about coverage about Israel in certain media because they are investing in coverage there. Not to say that it's not important, but the whole continent of Africa, is there nothing interesting going on there that they don't need more reporters than that? So even the way that news organizations choose to resource where they want to get their reporters on the ground affects the way perception of the events also.
But now, before October 7th, that wasn't the case. People were getting bored with the Middle East. It was generally felt in the United States among like policymakers that the United States wasn't really focusing on the Middle East, and reporters weren't being sent to the Middle East. The bureaus there were very small. After October 7th, every single writer, reporter, anybody who imagined themselves to be a writer, reporter in Israel had a job. Everybody's bringing on, we have an Israel editor, and everybody else was hiring her. We're like, no, you have to write for us. But there's a huge competition. So you're right, we have too many journalists right now in the Middle East. It's not helping the situation. And again, we have too many journalistic forums. And I am not a big supporter of cable TV. I have a few friends who are work on cable TV, but do we need 24-hour news coverage for all these years? I mean, thank you, Ted Turner. It was an interesting idea. Maybe if there's a major earthquake, maybe, but we just don't need it. It's just too much for us. Do we need Fox? Do we need MSNBC? I just don't think we need any of them. And in fact, most young people aren't even watching them. Do we need to have constant coverage? So what's going to happen is soon everyone's going to get their news from social media. But places like CNN, all these media organizations are now trying to get into social media, or they have been, but they're always trying to find new ways in that are more successful, just like we are.
Other questions?
Yeah, I see one back there. Yeah.
Thank you. So I took one journalism class, and one of the only things I remember is the instructor saying that no matter what writer you read, there's always a bias. They always come from an angle. That was 40 years ago. Now, as you said, there are so many self-appointed journalists who don't even have journalistic training. So understanding everybody comes from somewhere. Jerusalem Post has an angle, Al Arabiya has an angle. Can you recommend how you can get a big picture of the world with all of these sources, but probably none that tell you the whole story?
Well, I think that it's such a great question, that just realizing that no one can tell you the whole story, and that every journalist, every person who has any opinion is a person who is, filtering. Sometimes they seem like they know a lot. Sometimes they just, emanate authority. Those are the ones that make me the most nervous. So you have to just keep this in mind, whatever you're reading. It's very hard. First of all, I would say that there is, the whole point of journalism. There's always been two schools of journalism. One is that there's objective journalism, and two is that no journalism can be objective. And I think there's something happening that's in the middle, that you strive for objectivity, but you realize you realize that you can't be completely objective, because we see how systemic ideas are and how systemic institutions work, and journalism is one of those. But on the other hand, I'm really concerned about opinion. Like, opinion journalism is really, it just fills more and more of our newspapers and fills more and more of social media. And opinion is exactly what it is. It's just an opinion. And sometimes what I really look for is reported opinion. So I know people have different feelings about Tom Friedman. Some people hate Tom Friedman. Some people like Tom Friedman. There's one thing I like about Tom Friedman. I don't always agree with everything he writes, but he does really great reported columns. He goes someplace. He talks to lots of people. He has great access. Sometimes he talks to people who are less famous. Sometimes he's, whatever. He's not always talking to the regular suspects, although he's pretty establishment at this point. But he's really reporting what he's seeing. And I think that even in his columns, and then he's making conclusions based on those. It's much better for me when I see the reporting, what the thinking that goes into somebody's opinion. But in so many opinions that we see, you don't get to see that. Now you may disagree with that, and sometimes what I'll do is I'll Google, and I do Google. I don't go to TikTok, And actually, a lot of my whole staff now, a lot of them use AI. They don't even Google anymore. But I'll Google the individual people who are being quoted in the article, and I'll learn a little bit about them, and then I'll think about what do I think about this. So that's a perfectly good thing. Wikipedia is actually interesting, and Wikipedia may be replaced completely by AI in the near future, but one thing good about Wikipedia is that it has sources on the bottom, and I use those sources. So they'll be like, have a little citation. I'll go to the bottom and I'll find what article this is based on, and then I'll get to say, well, this is really a stupid article. I disagree with this article. Who is this person, and why? What are these ideas? So you have to kind of follow. You have to follow the track thinking, track ideas. But anyways, it's very hard. In journalism does do some very good things, but there are also so many kinds of journalism right now, like opinion journalism. Then there's solutions journalism, people who are trying to make solutions out of journalism. Then there's the old-fashioned newspaper journalism, which sort of equates, well, Donald Trump said this, but then Joe Biden said this, but then so-and-so said this, and this person did. So as if sometimes these things are equatable, and they're not equatable. So I'm thinking about these things every day, and I don't have clear answers. I just try to be sure I follow ideas as far as I can follow them. And then the other thing is to find a group of people. So I'm really lucky because I have amazing, brilliant people that I work with every day, like including Robert Siegel, who came from NPR and he works at Moment, or just all sorts of people, young and old, some Jewish, not all of them Jewish. And so the great thing, I feel like sometimes I should just video our editorial meetings, because it's so interesting to talk about these things with a group of people who are really smart and bring different things to it, and that I hope comes out in the magazine.
We have time for one more question.
You mentioned about debate, where you don't like debates that much. I like debates, but I think they're run terribly badly because the people that are debating are allowed to lie, whether they're actually lying or whether they're just manipulating facts and statistics. And the example I'll give is like, if there was one murder in New York last year, and then this year there were 2 murders, one person can stand up there and say there's a 100% increase in the murder rate in New York, and it's just, and the moderator will not call back on that. So that's manipulating statistics. If I may give one other example, I used to work in the clothing industry, in the manufacturing side, and if we made a $10 garment that was sold in a store for $20, I would look at it and say my markup is 100%. You ask the retailer who's holding the $20 garment, what's the markup, and they would say 50%. And they're both right, but you got to identify where they're coming from. So why won't the moderators call people out when they either manipulate stats or actually lie?
So when I used to teach journalism at University of Michigan years ago, and I always taught a book which was called How to Lie with Statistics. I mean, statistics, I'm the daughter of a physicist. You can use statistics any way you want. I mean, there's so many articles that I look at in the newspaper and everywhere based on statistics. I'm like, who, what does that really mean? I mean, you can pick and choose your statistics. Look at the polls. You know, some polls come up with so-and-so's going to win. Some polls come up with another win. I tend to just, I think there's an over-reliance on statistics. I do think that you're talking about debates that are, I mean, political debates are a whole different animal. I would barely call them debates at this point. And I'm not sure what they are. They're really spectacles. They're entertainment spectacles. You're really not getting to know people in any real way. They become meaningless. I was thinking more even, like we have one section which is called Moment Debate. And so we asked this last time, should students be disciplined for chanting from the river to the sea? And we had one person say yes, and one person say no. But what we discovered, because we actually talked to like 10 people, is everyone was a little bit more nuanced than the yes or the no. It took us a while to get to people who one would be agreed to say yes and one would agree to say no, because there were so many different opinions. But then we have this other section, which we do called Moment Symposium, where, again, we ask all sorts of people these different questions, and then you really learn from them. So yes, our political debates are sad. They're really sad. We're really not getting to know our candidates. I mean, I'm not too sure in this particular case. I think we already know Biden, we already know Trump, and I'm not sure, again, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure what we could learn from about any of them. There wasn't any unknown in this particular race to begin with. But there was one more question back there.
I just wanted to add, my favorite thing about statistics that I've heard in terms of debates is that 80% of all statistics are made up at debates.
Because you remember them. You also, when you're giving a talk, they get very simplified. They oversimplified. You remember some numbers in your mind. It's not that you're remembering them deliberately wrong, but you're simplifying things. People simplify too much.
If you're interested in more substantive debates, I've seen that always. Sometimes it's still a little bit of the spectacle, but I forget if it's Oxford or Cambridge has debating society, and they videotape. And sometimes they actually, it's because it's not politicians who are seeking to win over or just been trained in sound bites. Oftentimes it might be pundit type people, or it could be scholars who are debating an issue, a topic. I think Harvard even has done that sometimes, and you get much deeper. These people disagree, but they disagree nicely. They're not trying to bash the other person over the head. They are trying to win the point, but they usually bring a lot of knowledge to it, and because it's done really as a point-counterpoint where they're addressing the other person's comment, you get more substance.
And we do that here. We're in the magazine. When we print them, we make them all answer the same questions, and then we can edit them to get them to actually respond to one another, because another great thing in debates is you just say what you want to say. You don't actually respond to somebody. I prefer, in our Moment Live program, we actually just do conversations with people. I feel like conversations are a way where you really get to know people in a different way. You don't have to, and the conversation may not be confrontational. The idea of a conversation is to learn. I've noticed that after October 7th, I've never really been agreeing with most of the editorial op-eds on the Wall Street Journal. Suddenly there are some that I agree with, so how the tectonic plates have changed. But I was noticing that Joseph Epstein, who is a famous essayist from University of Chicago, wrote one about how the shows like Meet the Press used to be like you would actually learn something. But now it's just like journalists trying to get you in these gotcha questions and trying to make news as opposed to understanding. And what we all need is understanding. But I know you had a question.
We'll do final question.
Okay.
I don't know if you know the answer to this or have an answer for this, but something that's been really bugging me is after, the crimes against women that have occurred in October 7th, I heard, the gal who was kidnapped, and we all saw the footage of her being taken from the Jeep, the trunk of the Jeep, and I think her name's Nama, but her mother's a gynecologist. Yeah, has been talking about, how afraid she is of her daughter being pregnant in captivity and all of the, physical issues that would occur, et cetera. And I'm like, where's that coming from? And so recently I saw an interview with one of the medical directors that was handling the hostages, and she wouldn't give a number, but talked about how a lot of these young hostage women who were released, and girls, a lot of them have had abortions as a result. They were impregnated. And I'm just wondering why, with all of the stuff where, the Jews have been called genocidal and, and we're colonialist and this and that, why that has not been brought out more clearly as an issue, as something I think that should be brought out in terms of, how deep this war has been for women. So that, I don't even know if you have an answer for that.
I think it actually has. It was so interesting because after October 7th, after October 14th and the Al Arab hospital attack, Israel went all out in creating all these videos of all the really very graphic, terrible things that happened, killings and hostage taking. And they were, and like even the Israeli embassy, which is down the street from my office, was like, come over and watch these. And I was like, I don't really, I don't think that many people want to come over and watch these. It was just, it was very hard for people to watch that. And I thought that was I know that they were trying to get the story out. I feel like the story about what happened to women has been much more successful in reaching people, and that there has been a lot of outrage, certainly, hearings in Congress with Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So I feel like that story is being told, and it's one that people can get their minds around more, I think, than the all of the entirety of the horrors there. I mean, it should be told more. I mean, what happens to people in war. But I guess just I hear about it so much. Maybe so many people I know are talking about it. But maybe it's not. Maybe I'm living in a bubble. Oh, I don't know about the pregnancy part. That's really interesting. I will actually check in with some of my editors about that. It's a really great point.
So we're gonna conclude here. If you do want to talk more, if you'll stick around for a couple minutes.
Yeah.
So thank you, Nadine, for another fascinating conversation. So tonight, 7 o'clock, we'll have Havdalah and then go into our third presentation, which is going to be about some amazing, inspiring Jewish women. Some you, I'm sure, have heard of, and others you probably never have heard of.
Yes.
So please come back, and then there'll be a dessert reception afterwards. You can also purchase her book if you didn't pre-order it, and she'll be happy to sign it for you as well. There are, I think, still a couple copies of Some Moment magazine. A lot of them got taken last night and already today, but there's a few copies left. If you'd like to avail yourself of those, thank you for sending those 3 copies here. And thank you again to Bert and Elaine Margolis for sponsoring today, and we'll see you tonight. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Is that helpful? Oh, good. Okay.